Greetings, friend, and welcome. So glad you could join us for Bedtime Biographies, where together we unwind and drift away to the soothing accounts of truly remarkable lives. Our journey this evening takes us to a dimly lit room in the south of France, where a man with fierce red hair and paint-stained fingers sits before a canvas, desperately trying to capture the way sunlight falls across a simple wooden chair. His name is Vincent van Gogh, and he's painting like his life depends on it, because in many ways it does. Before we properly begin Vincent's story, just a brief thought. If these calm explorations of significant lives help you unwind, please consider taking a moment to like this video and subscribe. It genuinely helps other curious minds discover these stories, and we're always curious for your reflections. Let us know in the comments below what you think of Vincent's journey and which historical figure you'd like us to explore in our next bedtime biography. Now, Van Gogh gets remembered a lot, sometimes as the tortured artist, sometimes as the madman who cut off his ear. But strip away the myths, and at its heart, his story is really just about one thing: what happens when someone refuses to stop creating, even when the world tells them they're worthless? What if the paintings that brought you nothing but rejection in life could somehow speak to millions after you're gone? Vincent spent his entire existence chasing that impossible dream through poverty, mental illness, and a loneliness so profound it could break your heart. Of course, history took his canvases and ran wild with them: museum exhibitions, record-breaking auctions, his face on coffee mugs and dorm room posters. But tonight, we're not here for the celebrity. We're just here to meet the man behind the masterpieces, a passionate, struggling, deeply human soul who saw beauty where others saw only ugliness. And now, as the day winds down, let's begin to trace the life and times of this remarkable artist. This is the bedtime biography of Vincent van Gogh. Chapter 1. The Boy Who Couldn't Quite Fit. The story begins on March 30th, 1853, in a small Dutch village called Groot-Zundert, a place where the fields stretched flat and endless under grey northern skies, and church bells marked time for farmers and their families. Here, in the parsonage next to the Reformed church, a boy named Vincent Willem van Gogh entered the world exactly 1 year to the day after his parents had buried another son with the exact same name. Think about that for a moment. Every birthday, a reminder of the ghost child who came before. Every time someone spoke his name, an echo of loss. His father, Theodorus, was a stern Protestant minister who believed in duty, discipline, and the divine order of things. His mother, Anna, painted watercolors as a hobby and passed down to Vincent her eye for color and form, though she never quite passed down the emotional warmth he desperately craved. Young Vincent absorbed it all: the heavy silences, the religious texts, the sense that somehow he was meant to fill a void that could never quite be filled. The Van Gogh household hummed with a peculiar tension. Theodorus conducted his services with proper solemnity, while Vincent's mother quietly mourned the first Vincent in ways she never fully expressed. Young Vincent grew up surrounded by younger siblings: Theo, Anna, Lise, Will, and Cor. But he remained somehow apart, watching the world through eyes that saw things just a bit differently than everyone else. By the time he reached school age, his teachers noted something unusual. The boy could draw remarkably well for his age, capturing the essence of a landscape or a figure with just a few quick strokes. But he also possessed what one instructor carefully called a difficult temperament. He asked uncomfortable questions. He challenged authority without meaning to offend. He felt things too deeply, cared too much, couldn't seem to develop the thick skin that helps most children navigate the casual cruelties of growing up. At 11, his parents sent him to boarding school in Zevenbergen, about 15 miles from home. The separation devastated him. Decades later, he would still remember standing at the window watching his parents' carriage disappear down the road, Feeling abandoned in a way that would shape his entire relationship with loneliness, he spent 2 years there, then moved to another school in Tilburg, where he showed promise in languages and drawing, but remained that odd, intense boy who didn't quite fit in with his classmates. Meanwhile, the Dutch countryside around him whispered its own lessons. The flat horizons taught him about negative space. The ever-changing skies showed him how light could transform the ordinary into something transcendent. The peasants working the fields demonstrated a kind of dignity in labor that would become central to his artistic vision. Vincent absorbed it all, storing these observations in that restless mind of his, though he couldn't have known yet that he was gathering material for masterpieces still decades away. At 16, Vincent's formal education ended abruptly. His parents couldn't afford to keep him in school, and besides, there was a family connection that needed leveraging. His uncle, another Vincent van Gogh, ran a successful art dealership called Goupil & C, and he'd agreed to take on his nephew as an apprentice at the branch in The Hague. So in 1869, young Vincent found himself surrounded by art for the first time in a professional capacity. The gallery smelled of varnish and money, walls covered with fashionable paintings that appealed to the Dutch bourgeoisie of the era. Landscapes with cows, portraits of merchants, pretty pictures for pretty parlors. Vincent actually excelled at first. He had a good eye, a persuasive manner when he bothered to be charming, and that family connection didn't hurt. Letters home showed genuine enthusiasm for the work. For 7 years, he moved through Goupil's various locations, The Hague, then London, then Paris. In London, something shifted. He was 20, living in a boarding house, and he fell desperately in love with his landlady's daughter, Eugénie Loyer. The feeling wasn't mutual. When she rejected him, revealing she was already engaged to someone else, Vincent spiraled into the first of many devastating heartbreaks that would punctuate his life. His work performance crumbled. He started telling customers that the fashionable paintings they wanted to buy were actually worthless trash, that they should be reading the Bible instead of decorating their walls. His managers were not amused. By 1876, he was dismissed from Goupil & C, ending any chance of a comfortable career in the art world's commercial side. What do you do when you're 23, unemployed, heartbroken, and convinced that material success is somehow sinful? If you're Vincent van Gogh, you turn to God with the same intensity you bring to everything else. He took a position as a teacher at a boarding school in England, barely making enough to survive. Then he tried being a Methodist minister's assistant. The passion was there, burning fierce and bright, but the practical skills were not. His sermons rambled, his manner unsettled people. Once again, he didn't quite fit. But Vincent had inherited his father's religious fervor without inheriting his father's ability to package it in socially acceptable ways. He decided to become an evangelist to the poor, the really poor, the kind of poor that made respectable church people uncomfortable. In 1879, he traveled to the Borinage, a coal mining region in Belgium where men descended into darkness every day and often didn't come back up. Vincent threw himself into missionary work with characteristic extremity. He gave away his clothes to miners' families until he was nearly naked himself. He slept on straw in a tiny hut, refusing any comfort while those around him suffered. He descended into the mines, felt the oppressive weight of earth above him, saw the conditions that broke men's bodies and spirits. The church authorities who'd sent him there were horrified. This wasn't what they meant by Christian charity. They wanted someone to save souls, not to become indistinguishable from the people he was supposed to be saving. After 15 months, they dismissed him. Too extreme, too intense, too much. Here's where the story gets interesting, though. Because it was there in the Borinage, in that place of suffering and darkness, that Vincent started drawing seriously again. Not the polite sketches of his youth, but something rawer, more honest. He drew the miners with their weathered faces and bent backs. He drew their wives and children. He drew poverty not as some abstract concept, but as the daily reality of people he'd grown to love. Something was shifting inside him. All those failures, all that rejection, all that intensity that made him impossible to employ, it was all searching for the right outlet. At 27 years old, living in his parents' parsonage again, broke and directionless, Vincent made a decision that would change everything. He would become an artist, not a commercial success, not a society painter producing pretty pictures for bourgeois parlors, but an artist who told the truth about life, about suffering, about the dignity of common people. An artist who painted what he felt, not what would sell. Of course, he had no formal training, no money, no prospects, no reason whatsoever to believe this would work out any better than any of his other failed ventures. But Vincent had one thing going for him, one person who believed in him when no one else did. His younger brother Theo had also gone into the art dealing business, and Theo promised to support Vincent financially while he learned to paint. It was a promise Theo would keep for the rest of Vincent's life, sending monthly allowances that barely covered rent and art supplies, enabling Vincent's artistic development while Vincent generated painting after painting that nobody wanted to buy. The early paintings are dark, almost aggressively dark. Vincent set up in his parents' home in Eton, then moved to The Hague, renting studio space and teaching himself to paint by studying books and copying works he admired. His subjects were the people society preferred to ignore: peasants, laborers, the old and weathered and poor. He painted them in browns and greys and blacks, capturing their exhaustion and their resilience. His approach to learning was typical Vincent: obsessive, single-minded, utterly consuming. He'd draw the same subject dozens of times until he got it right. He studied anatomy, perspective, the way fabric falls, the way light hits a weathered face. He painted rapidly, impatiently, sometimes scraping down a canvas and starting over, sometimes just moving on to the next one. Quality would come from quantity, he believed. You had to make a lot of bad art before you could make good art. In The Hague, he fell for another impossible woman, a pregnant prostitute named Sian Hornick. Vincent being Vincent, he didn't just have an affair. He moved her and her children into his studio, proposed marriage, created a whole domestic situation that scandalized his family and alarmed his brother Theo. He painted Sian constantly, seeing in her weathered face the same dignity he saw in peasants and miners. But the relationship was doomed from the start. Sian wanted stability Vincent couldn't provide. His family threatened to cut him off entirely. After about a year, they separated and Vincent moved back to his parents' parsonage in Nuenen. The Nuenen period, from 1883 to 1885, produced some of Vincent's most important early work. He was painting constantly now, dozens and dozens of studies of peasant heads, of hands gnarled by labor, of simple cottage interiors. He was trying to capture something essential about rural life, something true and honest that went beyond mere picturesque prettiness. This all culminated in The Potato Eaters, painted in 1885. It shows a peasant family gathered around a table in their dim cottage, sharing a meal of potatoes by lamplight. The faces are rough, almost grotesque. The colors are muddy browns and sickly greens. It's not a painting that makes poverty look noble or romantic. It makes poverty look like what it is: grinding, exhausting, depleting. But there's something else there too, a sense of community, of people who've worked the land with these same hands, now reaching for their simple meal. Vincent was immensely proud of this painting. He thought it was his breakthrough, the work that would announce him as a serious artist. He sent it to Theo in Paris expecting validation. Theo's response was diplomatically lukewarm. The technique wasn't quite there yet. The colors were too dark. It wouldn't appeal to contemporary tastes. Vincent was devastated but also defiant. This was the kind of painting he wanted to make. If the world didn't like it, perhaps the world needed to change its taste. Life in Nuenen was complicated in other ways too. Vincent conducted an affair with a neighbor, Margot Begeman, who was 10 years older and desperately in love with him. When her family forbade marriage, she attempted suicide by poisoning. Vincent saved her life, but the scandal made his position in the village untenable. Then his father died suddenly in 1885, and Vincent felt the loss more deeply than he'd expected. For all their conflicts, Theodorus had been one of the few constants in his chaotic life. He needed to leave, needed to grow, needed to see what real artists were doing. In late 1885, Vincent enrolled at the Royal Academy of Fine Arts in Antwerp. It lasted all of 4 months. The academic approach, the rigid rules, the emphasis on classical ideal beauty, it was all wrong for someone whose entire artistic vision centered on capturing raw, unvarnished truth. He argued with his instructors, he ignored their assignments. He painted what he wanted to paint, not what they told him to paint. But Antwerp gave him something crucial. He discovered Japanese woodblock prints, those bold lines and flat areas of color and unusual perspectives. He saw how artists like Hiroshige and Hokusai could suggest depth and emotion with remarkable economy of means. He started collecting these prints, pinning them up in his studio, studying them obsessively. They were teaching him something about color and composition that his academic instructors couldn't. More importantly, Antwerp gave him the courage to make his next move. Theo, now managing the Montmartre branch of Goupil-Lancy in Paris, had been gently suggesting that Vincent come join him. Paris was where everything was happening in the art world. The Impressionists had exploded traditional painting with their bright colors and loose brushwork. New ideas were in the air, new possibilities. In February 1886, Vincent sent Theo a brief note. "Do not be cross with me for having come all of a sudden." He'd arrived in Paris unannounced, ready or not, about to encounter the movement that would transform his dark Dutch paintings into something nobody had ever seen before. Paris hit Vincent like a revelation, like someone had switched on electric lights in a room where he'd been painting by candlelight his whole life. The city in 1886 was the undisputed center of the art world, and Vincent arrived just as revolutionary new approaches to painting were reaching full force. The Impressionists, Monet and Renoir and Pissarro, had already shocked the establishment with their loose brushwork and their obsession with capturing light. Now a younger generation was pushing even further. Theo introduced Vincent to everyone who mattered. Camille Pissarro, the gentle anarchist painter who took Vincent under his wing. Paul Signac, who was developing a technique called pointillism, building up images from thousands of tiny dots of pure color. Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, the aristocrat turned bohemian chronicler of Montmartre's nightlife. And perhaps most fatefully, Paul Gauguin, the former stockbroker turned primitive-seeking artist who would later play a tragic role in Vincent's story. The Parisian art scene congregated in cafes and studios, in the paint shops of Père Tanguy, who'd let artists pay for supplies with paintings, in the informal exhibitions and heated debates about color theory and the nature of modern art. Vincent absorbed it all with his characteristic intensity. His palette lightened almost immediately. Those muddy Dutch browns gave way to bright yellows and pure blues and vivid greens. He started painting flowers, streets, portraits, anything and everything, trying to catch up to years of artistic development he'd missed while struggling in the Netherlands. He studied with Fernand Corman, whose studio attracted ambitious young artists, but Vincent's real education happened outside formal instruction. He painted alongside other artists, copying their techniques, arguing about approaches, slowly developing his own unique style. The Japanese prints he'd discovered in Antwerp became even more important. He made copies of them, not exact reproductions, but interpretations that showed how deeply he understood their compositional innovations. But Paris was also expensive and overwhelming and exhausting. Vincent and Theo shared an apartment in Montmartre, and while Theo was patient and supportive, living with Vincent couldn't have been easy. The mood swings, the passionate arguments about art, the studio that constantly smelled of paint and turpentine, the friends Vincent brought home at odd hours, the paintings that accumulated faster than they could be stored or sold. Vincent was drinking too much, smoking too much, not eating properly, pushing himself too hard. His health began to deteriorate. He had bad teeth, stomach problems, possibly syphilis from his time with prostitutes, and what we'd now recognize as serious mental health issues that Paris's stimulation only amplified. The social anxiety he'd always felt became more pronounced. Yes, he'd found a community of artists, but he still felt like an outsider, even among outsiders. He painted self-portraits constantly during this period, over 20 of them in just 2 years. They show us a Vincent in transformation. The early ones still carry traces of that dark Dutch style, but gradually they lighten, the colors becoming more vibrant, the brushwork more confident. In some, he looks almost dapper with his cleaned-up appearance and new Parisian clothes. In others, you can see the strain around his eyes, the tension in his jaw, the sense of someone barely holding it together. 2 of his Paris paintings particularly captured what he was learning. Agostina Segatori, sitting in the Café du Tambourin, shows the owner of one of his favorite cafes, a woman he may have had an affair with, sitting before a table with a glass of beer. The colors are bright but controlled, the composition influenced by those Japanese prints he loved. It's a modern urban scene, thoroughly Parisian, nothing like those Dutch peasants he used to paint. Then there's Basket of Apples, a seemingly simple still life that shows how far his color sense had evolved. The apples are painted in strokes of pure color, yellows and reds and greens that vibrate against each other. It's not about making photorealistic apples, it's about capturing the essence of appleness, the way light hits fruit, the pure pleasure of color for its own sake. But Vincent was also starting to realize something troubling. Paris was changing his art for the better. Yes, but it was destroying his health and peace of mind. The city was too much, too stimulating, too chaotic. He dreamed of something different, a place where he could work in peace, where the light was clear and strong, where he could paint nature directly without all the urban noise and competition. He started talking about moving south to Provence, where the sun shone bright and the landscape hadn't been painted to death by generations of artists. He imagined founding a kind of artists' colony there, a studio of the South where like-minded painters could work together, support each other, create something new away from Paris's commercial pressures. Theo was skeptical but supportive. He'd continue the monthly allowance. Vincent could find a place to rent, set up a studio, invite other artists to join him. In February 1888, after 2 years in Paris, Vincent boarded a train heading south toward Arles. He was 34 years old, still hadn't sold a significant painting, and was about to enter the most productive and most famous period of his entire life. Arles hit Vincent like a drug. He arrived in late February 1888, stepping off the train into a Provençal town that seemed to glow with exactly the kind of light he'd been dreaming about. Yes, it was still winter, and there was actually snow on the ground, which surprised him. But even in winter, the southern sun had a quality completely different from the grey northern skies of his homeland. Everything felt sharper, clearer, more intensely itself. Within days, he was painting obsessively. The landscape around Arles, the orchards beginning to bloom with spring's arrival, the fields stretching toward distant mountains, the winding roads and simple farmhouses. He wrote to Theo constantly, letters filled with excitement and color descriptions, and accounts of how many canvases he was completing. Some days he'd finish an entire painting in a single session, working with a speed and confidence he'd never felt before. He rented a studio in what he called the Yellow House, a building with yellow walls and green shutters on the Place Lamartine. The rent was cheap, the light was perfect, and Vincent immediately started planning to turn it into that studio of the South he'd dreamed about. He'd decorate the rooms, furnish them simply but adequately, and invite artist friends from Paris to come join him. Together they'd create a new kind of art, something that captured the intensity of southern light and the simple beauty of Provençal life. The paintings from this period explode with color. The pink peach tree captures spring blossoms against a turquoise sky. The sour shows a farmer scattering seed, while a huge yellow sun dominates the horizon. Harvest at La Crau depicts the summer fields under that relentless southern sun. Vincent was discovering what that bright Provençal light did to color, how it bleached and intensified simultaneously, how shadows turned purple and skies went from blue to yellow to green depending on the time of day. But he was also isolating himself. Arles wasn't Paris. The locals thought this strange red-haired foreigner who painted outdoors in all weather was probably crazy. He didn't speak their dialect well. He had no social circle beyond occasional drinks with the postman Joseph Ruler, whose magnificent beard Vincent painted multiple times. Most days it was just Vincent and his canvases and that huge sun beating down. The loneliness gnawed at him. He needed artistic companionship, intellectual stimulation, someone to talk to about color theory and Japanese prints and the nature of modern art. He wrote letter after letter to Paul Gauguin, begging him to come south, promising that Theo would support them both financially, painting an idyllic picture of two artists working side by side in Provençal paradise. While waiting for Gauguin's response, Vincent painted the Yellow House itself multiple times, trying to capture what it meant to him. In the most famous version, the building glows against an evening sky, its windows lit from within, a promise of warmth and fellowship. He was preparing rooms for Gauguin, buying simple furniture, hanging Japanese prints, and his own paintings on the walls. He wanted everything perfect for his friend's arrival. He also painted sunflowers, lots and lots of sunflowers. These weren't delicate still lifes in the Dutch tradition. These were monuments to yellow, celebrations of the color itself. He painted sunflowers in full bloom and sunflowers beginning to wilt, sunflowers in simple vases against yellow backgrounds. The paintings were aggressive in their yellowness, almost assaultive, as if Vincent was trying to capture the sun itself on canvas. "I'm painting with the gusto of a Marseillais eating bouillabaisse," he wrote to Theo, which won't surprise you when it's a question of painting large sunflowers. The effect is quite something. That summer of 1888 was perhaps Vincent's happiest time as an adult. He was productive, the weather was glorious, he had his studio and his project, and his dream of the artistic community he was building. Yes, he was poor and largely friendless, and drinking too much cheap wine and probably not eating enough. Yes, his mental state was fragile and getting more so. But the paintings poured out of him, masterpiece after masterpiece, though of course nobody was calling them masterpieces yet. In October, Gauguin finally agreed to come. Vincent was ecstatic. He prepared Gauguin's bedroom with special care, painting a series of works specifically to decorate it, including the bedroom, that famous painting of his own simple sleeping quarters with the wonky perspective and the intense colors, chairs and table and bed all slightly skewed, everything saturated with meaning. When Gauguin stepped off the train in Arles on October 23, 1888, Vincent was waiting at the station, probably vibrating with excitement and nervousness. Finally, his dream was beginning. Two artists working together in southern light, creating something new and important. What could possibly go wrong? Everything, as it turned out. Absolutely everything. The collaboration started well enough. Gauguin was older, more worldly, more successful, and he arrived in Arles with definite ideas about art that didn't always align with Vincent's. But at first, the differences seemed stimulating rather than destructive. They painted together, critiqued each other's work, visited the local museum, took walks in the countryside. Vincent cooked elaborate dinners while Gauguin managed their limited finances more sensibly than Vincent ever could. Gauguin painted Vincent painting sunflowers, capturing his intense concentration. Vincent painted Gauguin's chair, a more elegant piece of furniture than his own simple seat, with books and a candle suggesting intellectual sophistication. They were creating a record of their collaboration, this brief moment when two hugely important artists shared a studio in provincial France. But the cracks appeared quickly. Gauguin liked to paint from imagination, composing scenes in his head and then executing them in the studio. Vincent needed to paint from life, to stand before his subject and capture what he saw directly. Gauguin thought Vincent's approach was too literal, too dependent on external reality. Vincent thought Gauguin's method was too artificial, too divorced from lived experience. They argued about money, about painting techniques, about whether to clean the studio or leave it in creative chaos. Gauguin was neat and organized. Vincent was decidedly not. Gauguin had traveled to Martinique and Brittany, had lived adventurously, had left behind a wife and children to pursue art. Vincent had his books and his Japanese prints and his theories, but relatively little life experience beyond failure and rejection. The arguments grew more heated. Vincent's mental state, always precarious, began to deteriorate under the stress. He was drinking more, sleeping less, working himself into states of near hysteria. Gauguin wrote to Theo expressing concern. This wasn't working out the way either of them had hoped. He was thinking about leaving. For Vincent, this was catastrophic. His dream of the studio of the South was collapsing. The one friend he'd convinced to join him wanted to abandon him like everyone else always abandoned him. All the old wounds of rejection and inadequacy tore open. He was that boy watching his parents' carriage disappear again, that young man rejected by Eugénie Loyer, that missionary dismissed by the church, that artist whose paintings nobody wanted. On December 23, 1888, something snapped. The exact sequence of events remains disputed, but here's what we know for certain. Vincent, in a state of extreme psychological distress, took a razor and cut off a portion of his left ear. Not the entire ear, as popular myth has it, but a significant piece of it, probably the lower part of the earlobe. Then, in an act that suggests just how disturbed he was, he wrapped the severed flesh in newspaper, walked to a brothel he and Gauguin had frequented, and presented it to a woman there, possibly a prostitute named Rachel, who'd shown him kindness. "Guard this object carefully," he reportedly told her, before stumbling back to the yellow house. The next morning, police found Vincent unconscious in his blood-soaked bed. Gauguin, who may have witnessed the initial breakdown, had fled to a hotel and would leave Arles permanently within days, never seeing Vincent again. Vincent was taken to the local hospital where Dr. Felix Ray, a young physician, treated his wound and tried to understand what had happened. The theories about why Vincent mutilated himself have proliferated over the decades. Was it a psychotic break triggered by Gauguin's planned departure? Was he hearing voices, perhaps hallucinations, telling him to harm himself? Did it have something to do with the story of Christ's suffering, a kind of religious self-sacrifice? Or was it, as some recent scholars suggest, actually Gauguin who injured Vincent during an argument, with Vincent covering for his friend? We'll probably never know for certain. What we do know is this. Vincent spent about 2 weeks in the hospital, was released on January the 7th, 1889, and returned to the Yellow House to find Gauguin gone and his dream shattered. The townspeople of Arles, already suspicious of the strange foreign artist, now saw him as actively dangerous. 30 of them signed a petition calling him the red-headed madman and demanding his confinement. He tried to resume painting, producing works that showed no decline in skill despite everything, but his mental state remained fragile. In February, he had another breakdown and was hospitalized again. When he returned to the Yellow House, he found it had been shut down by police. By late February, the local authorities had him committed to the hospital's isolation ward. The Studio of the South was finished. The Yellow House period was over. Vincent's most productive phase had ended in madness and mutilation, but somehow, impossibly, his greatest work still lay ahead. Because Vincent van Gogh was about to spend a year in an asylum where, behind locked doors, he would create some of the most famous paintings in the history of art. On May 8, 1889, Vincent voluntarily admitted himself to the asylum at Saint-Paul-de-Moselle in Saint-Rémy-de-Provence, about 20 miles from Arles. He knew he needed help, needed structure, needed a place where he could be monitored during his episodes of what he called his illness. The asylum was a former monastery, its thick stone walls enclosing gardens and patients suffering from various mental afflictions. Vincent was given a small bedroom and, crucially, permission to use a second room as a studio. Dr. Théophile Peyron, the asylum's director, diagnosed Vincent with epilepsy, which wasn't accurate but was a reasonable guess, given the era's limited understanding of mental illness. We'd now probably diagnose him with some combination of bipolar disorder, possible schizophrenia, and temporal lobe epilepsy, complicated by malnutrition, alcohol abuse, and the effects of drinking paint thinner and eating his paints. Whatever the exact diagnosis, Vincent experienced periods of intense productive clarity, interrupted by devastating breakdowns where he couldn't work at all. During his lucid periods, Vincent painted with an urgency that suggests he knew his time might be limited. The asylum's garden became his first subject. He painted the irises growing there, those purple and white flowers rendered with such intensity that you can almost feel Vincent's relief at being able to work again. Irises shows his style fully mature now, the bold outlines borrowed from Japanese prints, the colors singing against each other, the perspective slightly tilted in that way that makes everything feel more alive, more immediate. From his bedroom window, Vincent could see the Alpilles mountains and the wheat fields beyond the asylum walls. This view became an obsession. He painted it over and over at different times of day and in different seasons. The wheat fields would become golden, then green, then golden again. The mountains stayed constant, the sky changed endlessly. In one version, a reaper works the golden field under a brutal sun, and Vincent saw in this image something about death, about the cycle of life and harvest, about working until you can't work anymore. Then there was The Starry Night, painted in June 1889 from memory and imagination rather than direct observation. It shows the view from his window transformed into something cosmic and swirling. The stars and moon seem to pulse with energy. The sky moves in great spiraling waves. A cypress tree in the foreground flames upward like a dark fire. The village below remains calm and tiny, while the heavens explode with movement overhead. It's become so famous now, reproduced on everything from coffee mugs to dorm room posters, that it's hard to see it fresh. But imagine encountering this painting in 1889 when landscape painting meant careful, realistic depictions of nature. Vincent had taken the night sky and shown us what it felt like, not what it looked like. He'd painted emotion and energy and the strange magic of staring up at stars while knowing you're just a speck on a spinning ball of rock. He painted portraits when he could convince people to sit for him. L'Arlésienne depicted Madame Ginou, a café owner from Arles, based on a drawing Gauguin had made. He painted the asylum's orderly. He painted Dr. Perron's assistant. And he painted himself, over and over, self-portraits that tracked his deteriorating condition, his shaved head after one breakdown, his haunted eyes, his increasingly thin face. Between the productive periods came the attacks. Vincent would hear voices, become paranoid, sometimes try to drink his painting supplies or eat the paints themselves, which only made everything worse. After each episode, he'd be consumed with shame and despair, writing letters to Theo that mixed artistic observations with deep depression about his condition. He knew he was a burden. He knew Theo was supporting not just him, but also Theo's new wife Jo and their infant son, also named Vincent. The guilt was crushing. But somehow, during that year, at Saint-Rémy, Vincent produced about 150 paintings and over 100 drawings. The output was staggering. Between breakdowns, he worked like a man possessed, as if he had to capture everything before his mind betrayed him again. He painted the olive groves around the asylum, those gnarled ancient trees that twisted into fantastic shapes. He painted cypress trees, those dark, vertical elements that appeared again and again in his work, pointing upward like prayers or flames. He made copies of works by artists he admired, Millet and Delacroix, not because he couldn't paint original works, but because studying the masters helped him understand his own techniques. He painted flowers, landscapes, portraits, anything within reach during his moments of clarity. By early 1890, Vincent was starting to improve, or at least the attacks were becoming less frequent. He started thinking about leaving the asylum, about trying once more to make a life as an artist, about finding a place where he could work in peace without the constant fear of his next breakdown. Paris was too overwhelming. The South held too many painful memories. What he needed was somewhere quiet, somewhere close to Theo, somewhere with a doctor who understood his condition. On May 16, 1890, Vincent left the asylum at Saint-Rémy after 1 year and 8 days of confinement. He traveled north to Paris, where Theo met him at the station. They spent 3 days together, Vincent finally meeting Theo's wife Jo and their baby son, seeing the apartment filled with his own paintings that nobody wanted to buy, feeling the complicated mix of gratitude and guilt that came from knowing his brother had supported him through everything. But Paris was still too much. Instead, Theo had arranged for Vincent to move to Auvers-sur-Oise, a small village about 20 miles northwest of Paris. There, Dr. Paul Gachet, a physician who specialized in treating artists and was himself an amateur painter, would watch over Vincent while allowing him the freedom to work. Vincent arrived in Auvers on May 20, 1890. The village was picturesque in that French countryside way, with old houses climbing a hillside, a church with a typical bell tower, wheat fields spreading across the surrounding landscape. Vincent immediately liked it. He rented a small room above a café for 3 francs 50 a day and got to work. What followed was perhaps the most intense period of productivity in art history. In just 70 days, Vincent completed roughly 70 paintings. That's 1 painting per day on average. Though of course, some days he'd do more, some days less. Some days the depression would be too heavy to lift his brush, but the output was phenomenal. More than that, the quality remained incredibly high. These weren't rushed, sloppy works. They were masterpieces. Dr. Gachet became both physician and friend. Vincent painted him twice, showing a melancholy man with his head resting on his hand, a foxglove in front of him. The paintings capture something about Gachet's sadness, his own complicated relationship with melancholy. Vincent wrote to Theo that Gachet was sicker than I am, but in a good-natured way, suggesting he recognized a kindred spirit in this doctor who collected art and understood artists' particular madness. He painted the church at Auvers, making it look somehow ominous despite the bright daylight, the building seeming to loom and shift, the perspective slightly off in that way Vincent had perfected. He painted the town hall on July 14th, France's national holiday, showing bunting and flags celebrating Bastille Day. He painted portraits of village children, of working people, of anyone who'd sit still long enough. And he painted the wheat fields, enormous canvases of wheat fields under turbulent skies, wheat fields with crows, wheat fields at sunset, wheat fields that seemed to pulse with energy and movement. These paintings feel apocalyptic somehow, as if Vincent was seeing more than just agricultural landscape, as if he was seeing the end of something. Wheatfield with Crows is probably the most famous, often described as his last painting, though that's not actually true. It shows a wheat field in varying shades of yellow and gold, a dark, stormy sky above, and 3 paths leading into the field, going nowhere in particular. Black crows rise from the wheat or descend toward it, you can't quite tell which. The brushwork is violent, agitated, the paint applied in thick swirls. It's a profoundly disturbing painting despite its bright colors, as if Vincent was putting his despair directly onto canvas. But he was also painting quieter things, gardens, flowers, portraits that showed genuine affection for his subjects. There's a tenderness in some of these Auvers paintings that contradicts the popular image of Vincent as purely tortured and despairing. Yes, he was struggling. Yes, the depression was crushing at times. But he was also capable of seeing beauty, of capturing moments of peace, of painting a simple vase of roses with genuine joy in the color and form. He wrote to Theo constantly, letters that mixed practical concerns about money and supplies with observations about art and life. The letters reveal a complicated emotional state, grateful for Theo's support but guilty about being a burden, proud of his work but despairing that nobody wanted to buy it, hopeful about his artistic development but terrified of another breakdown. In July, Vincent traveled to Paris to visit Theo. The visit didn't go well. Theo was stressed about work, about money, about his baby son's health. Jo later remembered Vincent as agitated, overwhelmed by Paris, arguing with Theo about things she didn't fully understand. Vincent returned to Auvers in a dark mood, the depression settling over him like one of those heavy skies in his wheatfield paintings. On July 27, 1890, a Sunday afternoon, Vincent walked into the wheat fields around Auvers carrying his painting supplies. At some point during that afternoon, he also acquired or had been carrying a small revolver. And there, alone in the fields he'd painted so many times, surrounded by the golden wheat and the enormous sky, Vincent van Gogh shot himself in the chest. The bullet didn't kill him immediately. It entered his chest at an odd angle, missing his heart, lodging somewhere near his spine. Vincent managed to stumble back to the Ravoux Inn where he rented his room, climbing the stairs, collapsing on his narrow bed. The innkeeper, Arthur Ravoux, found him there that evening and asked what happened. "I wounded myself," Vincent reportedly said, or maybe I shot myself. The accounts vary. They called for Dr. Gachet, who examined the wound and realized immediately that Vincent was beyond saving. The bullet couldn't be removed without killing him. All they could do was make him comfortable and send word to Theo in Paris. Through that night and into the next day, Vincent lay in his small room, smoking his pipe despite the agony, occasionally speaking to the people gathered around his bed. Theo arrived on the afternoon of July 28th and rushed up to Vincent's room. The brothers sat together, Vincent on the bed, Theo beside him, and according to witnesses they spoke in Dutch about old times, about their childhood, about art, about the life they'd shared. "I wish I could die now," Vincent said at one point. Theo, weeping, told him not to talk like that they'd get through this together like they'd gotten through everything else, but they both knew. Through that second night, Vincent's condition deteriorated. Theo sat with him, holding his hand, watching his older brother slip away. In the early morning hours of July 29, 1890 at 1:30 a.m., Vincent van Gogh died. He was 37 years old. Theo later wrote that Vincent's last words were, "La tristesse durera toujours." The sadness will last forever. The funeral was held the next day. Dr. Gachet gave a eulogy praising Vincent as an honest man and a great artist, predicting that someday his work would be recognized. It was a small gathering. Theo, Dr. Gachet, a few local people, some artist friends from Paris including Émile Bernard, who made sketches of Vincent in his coffin, surrounded by his paintings and his beloved sunflowers. They buried him in the cemetery at Auvers, a simple grave that would later be joined by Theo's when he died just 6 months later, destroyed by grief and syphilis. The question that haunts every account of Vincent's death is simply, why? Why would someone painting masterpieces, finally finding his mature style, supported by a loving brother, choose to end his life in a wheat field? The simple answer is mental illness. Vincent had been fighting depression, psychosis, and various other afflictions for years. He'd had multiple breakdowns, spent time in an asylum, knew he was teetering on the edge of another collapse. The weight of being a burden to Theo, who now had a family to support, crushed him. He'd never sold enough paintings to support himself. He was 37 with no prospects, no hope of ever becoming financially independent, nothing to look forward to but more poverty and more breakdowns. But there's also a more complicated answer. Some recent scholars have questioned whether Vincent actually shot himself. They point out that the angle of the bullet wound was strange for a suicide, that Vincent was an experienced shooter from his time in the countryside and probably would have aimed for his head if he'd really wanted to die, that he was found without his painting supplies or the gun, that he initially told people it was an accident. There's a theory that he might have been shot accidentally by local teenagers who'd been teasing him, and that Vincent, being Vincent, chose to protect them by claiming it was suicide. We'll probably never know for certain. What we do know is that a brilliant, troubled man died in a small French village in the summer of 1890, and the world lost one of the most gifted painters who ever lived just when he was hitting his artistic stride. The immediate aftermath was quiet. A few obituaries appeared in art journals, some artist friends mourned, but mostly Vincent's death passed with little notice. He was just another failed painter, another casualty of the artistic life, another person who couldn't quite make it work. Theo was devastated. He wrote to his mother that Vincent's death had created an emptiness that could never be filled, that Vincent had been not just his brother but his best friend, that the paintings surrounding him felt like ghosts. Theo tried to continue working, tried to interest dealers and collectors in Vincent's work, but his own health collapsed rapidly. By November 1890, he was in a mental hospital in Utrecht. He died on January 25, 1891, just 6 months after Vincent. He was only 33 years old. They buried Theo next to Vincent in Auvers. The two brothers who'd supported each other through everything now lay side by side in a cemetery surrounded by those French wheat fields Vincent had painted so obsessively. Their graves are still there, covered with ivy, visited by thousands of people every year who come to pay respects to the artist and the brother who made his work possible. Here's the thing that makes Vincent's story almost unbearable in its irony. Nobody wanted his paintings when he was alive. He sold maybe 1, possibly 2 works during his entire career. He lived in poverty, depended entirely on Theo's monthly allowance, died thinking he was a failure. And then, after he was gone, everything changed. The person most responsible for Vincent's posthumous fame was Theo's widow, Jo van Gogh. After Theo died, Jo inherited hundreds of Vincent's paintings and thousands of his letters. She could have sold them quickly for whatever money she could get and moved on with her life. Instead, she devoted herself to building Vincent's reputation. She organized exhibitions, contacted critics and dealers, published the letters Vincent had written to Theo, carefully managed which works went where. She understood that Vincent's paintings were extraordinary, and she was determined that the world should see what she saw. It was a long, patient process. The art world doesn't usually embrace radical new visions immediately, even when the artist is conveniently dead and no longer around to be difficult. But slowly, people started paying attention. An exhibition in Paris in 1901 created buzz. Critics who'd ignored Vincent during his lifetime now proclaimed him a genius. Other artists, particularly the Fauves and the German Expressionists, recognized him as a predecessor, someone who'd broken open new possibilities for color and emotional expression. By the 1910s, Vincent van Gogh was becoming famous. The process accelerated through the 20th century. Museums fought to acquire his works, collectors paid increasing amounts for paintings that Vincent had traded for art supplies or given away. Books were written, exhibitions mounted, theories developed about his technique and his madness and his relationship to broader art movements. That story about cutting off his ear became legend, the quintessential tale of the tortured artist suffering for his vision. By the late 20th century, Vincent's paintings were selling for astronomical sums. Irises sold for $53 million in 1987. Portrait of Dr. Gachet went for $82 million in 1990, a record at the time. The Yellow House paintings, the sunflowers, the self-portraits, all became icons, reproduced endlessly, instantly recognizable to people who'd never set foot in an art museum. But money and fame, while impressive, aren't really the point. What matters is that Vincent's vision, that intense, emotional, color-saturated way of seeing the world, fundamentally changed how we think about art. Before Vincent, painting was mostly about representing reality with varying degrees of skill and interpretation. After Vincent, painting could be about expressing inner emotional states, about using color and brushwork to convey feelings rather than just depicting objects. The Expressionists took his emotional intensity and ran with it. The Abstract Expressionists took his gestural brushwork and pushed it even further from representation. Every artist who uses color emotionally rather than descriptively, who builds up thick layers of paint, who distorts reality to express inner truth, is working in Vincent's shadow. He didn't invent these approaches entirely, art history doesn't work that way, but he demonstrated their possibilities with an urgency and conviction that opened doors for everyone who came after. And then there's the personal resonance. Vincent's story, tragic as it is, speaks to anyone who's ever felt like a failure, who's struggled with mental health, who's created things the world didn't want, who's been supported by someone who believed in them when nobody else did. His letters to Theo, published by Joe, reveal a deeply human person wrestling with doubt and depression and the simple logistics of surviving as an artist. "I put my heart and soul into my work," he wrote in one letter, "and have lost my mind in the process." That line captures something essential about Vincent, that sense of complete commitment to his vision regardless of the cost. He couldn't paint any other way. He couldn't be less intense, less emotional, less himself, even though being himself made his life nearly impossible. Today, Vincent's paintings hang in major museums worldwide. The Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam houses the largest collection, over 200 paintings and 500 drawings. Lines of people queue to see Starry Night at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, to stand before those swirling skies and feel whatever it is that Vincent felt when he painted them. Tourists visit Arles and Auvers, following the trail of places Vincent painted, trying to see the landscape through his eyes. But maybe the most fitting memorial isn't in museums or tourist sites. Maybe it's simpler than that. It's in everyone who's ever looked at a Starry Night poster on their wall and felt less alone, everyone who's found comfort in knowing that someone else has felt overwhelming sadness and still created beauty. Everyone who's been struggling and taken hope from the fact that Vincent never stopped painting, even when nobody wanted his paintings. Because that's the real gift Vincent van Gogh left us. Not just beautiful paintings, though they are beautiful, but proof that creating matters even when the world says it doesn't, that expressing truth matters even when nobody's listening, that keeping going matters even when everything suggests you should stop. To really understand Vincent's achievement, we need to talk about what he did with color, particularly yellow. Before Vincent, yellow was just another color in the spectrum, useful for rendering sunlight or blonde hair or ripe lemons. After Vincent, yellow became something else entirely. Emotion made visible, hope and madness mixed together, the sun brought down to earth and spread across canvas. Look at the sunflower paintings. They're not beautiful in any conventional sense. The flowers are past their prime, petals dropping, stems bending, showing their age and decay. But Vincent painted them with such intensity, such conviction, such incredible yellowness that they transcend their humble subject matter. They're not really about sunflowers at all. They're about life and death, about things that burn bright and then fade, about finding beauty in imperfection. He mixed his yellows obsessively, combining chrome yellow with cadmium yellow, adding touches of ochre or orange or white to create dozens of different shades. Then he'd apply them in thick, visible brush strokes, the paint standing up from the canvas in ridges and swirls. You can see the movement of his brush, the speed at which he worked, the physical energy he put into making these paintings. This matters because Vincent was rejecting centuries of academic tradition that said paint should be applied smoothly, invisibly, creating an illusion of reality without revealing the artist's hand. Vincent wanted you to see how the painting was made, wanted the brush strokes themselves to carry meaning. When you look at a Van Gogh painting, you're not just seeing a landscape or a portrait. You're seeing Vincent's arm moving, his hand gripping the brush, his whole body involved in the act of creation. The thick paint application called impasto served another purpose too. It made the paintings more sculptural, more physical objects rather than just images. The paint catches light differently at different angles. The texture creates shadows within the painting itself. A Van Gogh in person is a radically different experience from a reproduction because so much of the power comes from that physical, three-dimensional quality. But Vincent's color choices weren't just intuitive or emotional. He studied color theory, particularly the work of Eugène Delacroix and the color wheel principles that showed how complementary colors intensify each other. He knew that putting yellow next to blue or purple makes both colors sing more intensely. He deliberately chose color combinations for maximum emotional impact, not just because they looked pretty. The bedroom painting demonstrates this perfectly. The walls are a light violet blue, the floor is red, the bed covers are yellow, the blanket is red. These aren't realistic colors. Nobody's bedroom actually looks like this. But the colors work together to create an emotion, a sense of calm and rest mixed with underlying intensity. Vincent wrote to Theo that the color should express absolute rest, but there's nothing restful about those saturated hues pushed right to their limits. Or consider the Night Café, painted in Arles in 1888. Vincent described it as showing a place where one can ruin oneself, go mad, or commit a crime. To achieve this, he used what he called clashing reds and greens, colors that fight with each other, creating visual tension and discomfort. The billiard table glows under harsh gas lamps. The walls seem to pulse with menace. It's a painting that makes you feel uneasy just looking at it, which was exactly Vincent's intention. This emotional use of color influenced countless artists who came after. The Fauves, whose name literally means wild beasts, took Vincent's color intensity and pushed it even further. The German expressionists used color to convey psychological states. The abstract expressionists built entire movements around the idea that color and gesture could express emotion directly without depicting anything recognizable. But Vincent paid a price for his color obsessions, and not just metaphorically. The paints he used contained toxic chemicals: lead white, arsenic-based emerald green, cadmium yellow. He'd sometimes put the brush in his mouth while working, accidentally ingesting small amounts of poison. He'd paint with turpentine in closed rooms, breathing the fumes for hours. Add this to his poor diet, his heavy drinking, his tendency to work in intense heat or cold, and you have a recipe for serious physical damage. Some researchers believe the yellows in Vincent's later paintings might be even more intense than he intended, because his vision was possibly affected by digitalis poisoning from the foxglove Dr. Gachet prescribed for his epilepsy. Digitalis can cause a condition where everything appears tinged with yellow and you see halos around lights. If true, those swirling yellow stars in starry night might be partly a medical side effect. But whether Vincent saw the world through yellow-tinted vision or simply chose to paint it that way, the effect is the same. He showed us a world more intensely colored, more emotionally charged, more alive than the one we normally see. He taught us that reality isn't just what's in front of your eyes. Reality is what you feel when you look at something, and color can express those feelings directly. If we only had Vincent's paintings, we'd know he was a genius, but we'd know nothing about the person behind them. Fortunately, Vincent wrote letters, lots and lots of letters, primarily to Theo, but also to other artists and friends. These letters, over 900 of them surviving, give us an incredibly intimate portrait of an artist's mind and heart. Vincent wrote the way he painted, intensely, urgently, without much concern for polish or propriety. The letters mix practical discussions about money and art supplies with philosophical reflections on the meaning of art, complaints about his health with detailed descriptions of the colors he saw in a sunset. He'd sketch in the margins to show Theo what he was working on. He'd quote literature and scripture. He'd confess his deepnesses and his loneliness with heartbreaking honesty. "What am I in most people's eyes?" he wrote to Theo in 1880. "A non-entity or an eccentric and disagreeable man, someone who has no position in society and never will have. Very well, even if that were true, I should want to show by my work what there is in the heart of such an eccentric man, of such a nobody." Reading these letters, you realize that Vincent was acutely aware of how others perceived him, how he was failing by conventional measures of success, how his life looked from the outside. But he was determined to justify his existence through his work, to prove that even a failure, even a nobody, could create something meaningful. The letters to Theo are particularly moving because they reveal the depth of their relationship. Theo wasn't just providing financial support. He was Vincent's primary emotional support, his closest friend, the one person who never gave up on him. Vincent poured out everything to Theo, his artistic discoveries, his mental struggles, his gratitude, his guilt about being a burden. "I wish I could manage to make you really understand that when you give money to artists, you are yourself doing an artist's work," Vincent wrote, trying to ease his guilt about depending on Theo's allowances. "I say this in my own interest, and it is the absolute truth." Theo's letters back don't survive in the same numbers, but we know he was unfailingly supportive, even when Vincent's demands were unreasonable, even when his own finances were stretched thin. The brothers had a bond that transcended normal sibling relationships. They were partners in Vincent's artistic project, with Theo enabling Vincent's work as surely as if he'd mixed the paints himself. Vincent also corresponded with other artists, particularly Paul Gauguin, Émile Bernard, and later Paul Signac. These letters show his intellectual engagement with contemporary art movements, his theories about color and composition, his beliefs about what art should do. He could be surprisingly critical, praising certain aspects of an artist's work while dismissing other parts. He had strong opinions, and wasn't shy about sharing them. One of the most touching aspects of the letters is Vincent's relationship with literature. He read voraciously Zola, Balzac, Shakespeare, Dickens, the Bronte sisters. He'd quote passages that moved him, draw parallels between literary characters and real people he knew. He saw his artistic project as connected to the great novels of the 19th century, trying to do with paint what Zola did with words, capture the reality of ordinary people's lives with honesty and compassion. I want to paint men and women with that something of the eternal, which the halo used to symbolize, he wrote in 1888, and which we seek to convey by the actual radiance and vibration of our coloring. The letters also document his mental deterioration with painful clarity. After his breakdowns, he'd write to Theo describing what he could remember of the episodes, expressing confusion about what was happening to him, fearing for his sanity. "It is rather queer," he wrote from the asylum, "that the result of this terrible attack is that there is hardly any very definite desire or hope left in my mind, and I wonder whether this is the way one thinks when, with the passions lessened, one descends the hill instead of climbing it." Jo van Gogh-Bonger's decision to publish these letters was crucial to Vincent's posthumous reputation. They revealed that the mad artist was actually a thoughtful, articulate person with a sophisticated understanding of art and a deep engagement with culture. They showed the human being behind the paintings, made Vincent sympathetic rather than just strange. Today, scholars pore over these letters for insights into Vincent's working methods, his influences, his state of mind at different points in his career. But you don't need to be a scholar to be moved by them. Just read a few letters and you'll hear Vincent's voice across the years, urgent and passionate and heartbreakingly honest, trying to explain why he had to paint, even when it cost him everything. Throughout all his transformations, from missionary to failed art dealer to mature artist, one theme remained constant in Vincent's work: his obsession with ordinary working people. He called them peasants, using the French term that carried more respect than the English translation might suggest. To Vincent, these were the real heroes, the people whose labor sustained society while receiving nothing but poverty and disrespect in return. This wasn't romanticization. Vincent had lived among coal miners in the Borean Age, had descended into those suffocating mines, had seen children working in conditions that would break most adults. He'd walked through rural villages where peasant families survived on potatoes and little else, their hands permanently stained with dirt, their faces aged beyond their years. He didn't paint them as noble savages or pastoral decoration. He painted them as they were, exhausted, often ugly by conventional standards, but possessed of a dignity that came from honest labor. The Potato Eaters embodies this philosophy perfectly. Those 5 figures gathered around their simple meal aren't idealized. Their faces are rough, almost primitive. The light is dim and dingy. The potatoes on their plates represent the absolute minimum of subsistence. But there's something sacred in the scene too, a sense of community and shared struggle that Vincent found more meaningful than all the wealth and refinement of bourgeois society. "I have tried to emphasize that these people, eating their potatoes in the lamplight," he wrote about the painting, "have dug the earth with those very hands they put in the dish, and so it speaks of manual labor and how they have honestly earned their food. I wanted to give the impression of a way of life quite different from that of us civilized people." That phrase, "us civilized people," carries so much weight. Vincent saw civilization as corrupt, artificial, divorced from the honest reality of work and earth. The peasants, for all their poverty, were somehow more authentic, more connected to essential human truths. This is why he painted sowers so often, seeing in that simple act of scattering seed a kind of timeless ritual connecting humanity to the land. His religious background, rejected in its orthodox form, found new expression in this veneration of labor. The peasants became his saints, their rough hands his icons. When he painted the sower against a huge yellow sun, the image carried echoes of Christ parables about seeds and harvest. But the sacred had been relocated from heaven to earth, from divine revelation to human toil. This attitude put him at odds with much of the art world, which preferred paintings that flattered wealthy patrons or presented poverty in safely picturesque ways. Vincent's peasants were too real, too unglamorous. They reminded viewers of uncomfortable realities about who produces wealth and who enjoys it. No wonder he couldn't sell his paintings to the bourgeois collectors Theo tried to interest in his work. But Vincent's commitment to these subjects was absolute. Even in the south of France, where the light and color transformed his palette, he kept painting working people. The postman, Joseph Roulin, with his magnificent beard and his simple dignity, became one of Vincent's favorite subjects. Vincent painted him multiple times, plus portraits of Roulin's whole family, his wife Augustine, their baby Marcel, their sons Armand and Camille. The Roulins were working class, living on a postman's modest salary, but Vincent painted them with as much care and respect as any aristocrat's portrait. The Sower, painted multiple times in Arles, shows this fusion of Vincent's peasant obsessions with his new southern palette. A figure strides across a field, scattering seed from a bag. Behind him, an enormous sun dominates the sky in shades of yellow and orange. The field is painted in complementary blues and purples. It's simultaneously a realistic depiction of agricultural labor and a symbolic image about creation, growth, and the cycles of nature. In his wheat field paintings from Overs, the peasants often disappear, leaving only the landscape they worked. But their labor is implied in every stalk of wheat, every furrow in the field. The reaper Vincent painted, that lone figure working under the brutal sun, becomes a meditation on death and harvest, on how work continues until it can't anymore. This identification with workers had psychological roots too. Vincent was a laborer himself, working with his hands, producing things the market didn't want, struggling to survive on inadequate income. He understood exploitation from personal experience. The difference between a peasant digging potatoes and Vincent mixing paints seemed smaller to him than the difference between either of them and the comfortable bourgeois class who consumed the fruits of their labor while contributing nothing. Near the end of his life, he wrote to Theo, "I tell you, I consciously choose the dog's path through life. I will remain a dog, I shall be poor, I shall be a painter." Being a dog meant being low, despised, outside respectable society. But it also meant being honest, loyal, true to his vision regardless of consequences. If that's what it took to paint truth as he saw it, Vincent was willing to pay that price. And in the end, that's exactly what he did. One of the strangest aspects of Vincent's artistic development was his obsession with Japan, a country he never visited and knew only through prints and descriptions. But Japanese art, particularly the woodblock prints that flooded into Europe in the late 19th century, fundamentally shaped his mature style. Vincent discovered these prints in Antwerp and became completely captivated. He collected them obsessively whenever he could afford to, eventually amassing hundreds. The prints, called ukiyo-e, or pictures of the floating world, showed landscapes, actors, courtesans, daily life scenes rendered with bold outlines, flat areas of color, and radical cropping that defied Western perspective rules. Artists like Hokusai and Hiroshige taught Vincent that you didn't need to paint three-dimensional illusions. You could flatten space, use bold outlines, let areas of pure color speak for themselves. The Japanese artists seemed to understand something that Western academic tradition had forgotten, that a painting is a flat surface covered with colors arranged in a certain way, and there's a kind of honesty in acknowledging that fact rather than trying to create illusionistic depth. Vincent made direct copies of several Japanese prints, including Hiroshige's Plum Park in Kameido and Sudden Shower over Shinohashi Bridge. But he didn't just copy them, He intensified the colors, exaggerated the effects, made them more Vincent than Hiroshige. These copies were exercises, ways of teaching himself how Japanese compositional principles worked. More importantly, he absorbed these lessons into his original works. The bold outlines around forms in his paintings come straight from ukiyo-e. The way he crops compositions unexpectedly, cutting off elements at the edge of the canvas, echoes Japanese design. The flattening of space, the decorative use of pattern, the courage to use pure, unmixed color, all derive from his Japanese studies. When Vincent moved to Arles in 1888, he imagined he was going to his own personal Japan. The south of France, with its bright sun and clear light and agricultural landscape, seemed to him like the Japan depicted in those prints. Never mind that he'd never actually seen Japan and that Provence looked nothing like the land of the rising sun. In Vincent's imagination, they merged into one ideal place where art and life and nature existed in perfect harmony. "I have no need to go to Japan," he wrote from Arles, which was both true and completely delusional. He decorated his yellow house with Japanese prints, creating an aesthetic environment that mixed French rural reality with Japanese artistic ideals. When Gauguin came to visit, Vincent wanted to create a studio of the South that would function like his imagined version of Japanese artistic community, with artists working together, learning from each other, living simply, and producing beautiful things. This fantasy of Japan represented something deeper than just artistic influence. It represented an alternative to Western modernity with all its ugliness and alienation. The Japan of Vincent's imagination, based on those ukiyo-e prints, was a place where artists were respected, where beauty was integrated into daily life, where the split between high art and craft didn't exist. Japanese printmakers, after all, were considered skilled workers rather than fine artists, which perfectly suited Vincent's identification with laborers. He painted several portraits that directly reference Japanese aesthetics. The courtesan is based on a Japanese print, but transformed through Vincent's color intensity. Portrait of Père Tanguy shows the old paint seller surrounded by Japanese prints, their bright colors and bold designs framing his kindly face. These weren't just decorative choices. Vincent was trying to bring Japanese principles into portraiture to show that Western and Eastern traditions could merge into something new. The irony, of course, is that Vincent's work doesn't actually look particularly Japanese beyond some superficial elements. His thick impasto, his violent brushwork, his emotional intensity were entirely Western, emerging from his Dutch roots and his French Impressionist influences. But the Japanese gave him permission to be bold, to simplify, to trust his own vision rather than following academic rules. This permission was crucial. Academic training taught artists to subdue their individuality in service of realistic representation. The Japanese prints showed Vincent that art could be personal, distinctive, idiosyncratic, and still be great. Each ukiyo-e artist had a recognizable style. Hokusai's waves didn't look like Hiroshige's waves. This validated Vincent's instinct that his own strange, intense way of seeing was legitimate. In his last months at Auvers, Vincent moved away from obvious Japanese references, but the lessons remained embedded in his style. The bold outlines, the flattened space, the willingness to let color and pattern carry emotional weight, all these stayed with him. When you look at something like Wheatfield Under Clouded Sky, with its simplified forms and decorative patterns of brushstrokes, you're seeing Europe filtered through Vincent's understanding of Japan. He never made it to the real Japan, never learned that his imagination bore little relationship to the actual country. But perhaps that doesn't matter. The Japan Vincent created in his mind, that place where art and labor and life flowed together naturally, was real enough to transform his work and contribute to his unique vision. Sometimes the most powerful influences are the ones we invent for ourselves. Vincent painted dozens of portraits throughout his career, but they're not portraits in the conventional sense. He wasn't interested in flattering his subjects or capturing superficial likeness. He was trying to paint something harder to define, the essence of a person, their inner life made visible through color and brushwork. His self-portraits are particularly revealing. He painted himself over 30 times, creating a visual diary of his deteriorating physical and mental condition. In the early self-portraits from Paris, he looks almost respectable, cleaned up, properly dressed, meeting the viewer's gaze with something approaching confidence. But as the years progress and the breakdowns accumulate, the self-portraits become more harrowing. Look at the self-portrait from 1889, painted in Saint-Rémy shortly after one of his attacks. His face is gaunt, his eyes enormous and haunted, his hair and beard unkempt. The background swirls with the same agitated energy as starry night, as if his mental turmoil is leaking out into the world around him. The colors are beautiful, blues and greens and touches of orange, but the overall effect is deeply unsettling. This is not a man at peace with himself or the world. Vincent understood that he was making these self-portraits partly because he couldn't afford to hire models, but there was more to it than economy. "I am looking for a deeper similarity than the photographers," he wrote about portraiture. He wanted to paint not just faces but souls, to use color and expression to convey something essential about personhood that couldn't be captured through realistic rendering alone. His portrait of Madame Ginou, l'Arlésienne, demonstrates this approach perfectly. She's dressed simply, sitting before a table with books. Her face is rendered with relative realism, but the colors are anything but realistic. The background shifts from yellow to green. Her dress is a dark, vibrant black that seems almost to glow. The overall effect makes her seem monumental, iconic, more than just a cafe owner from Arles. She becomes a symbol of something, though exactly what remains ambiguous: southern womanhood, quiet dignity, patient suffering. The portraits of the Roulin family show Vincent's ability to find depth and meaning in ordinary people. Postman Joseph Roulin, with his magnificent blue uniform and flowing beard, becomes a kind of secular saint in Vincent's rendering. Augustine Roulin, his wife, is painted rocking their baby Marcel, and Vincent transforms this simple domestic scene into something that echoes Renaissance Madonna paintings. He's secularizing religious iconography, finding the sacred in everyday life. Dr. Gachet's portrait, painted in over, shows the melancholy physician resting his head on his hand, a foxglove plant before him. The foxglove is significant both because Dr. Gachet prescribed digitalis derived from foxglove for Vincent's condition, and because the flower symbolizes both healing and poison. The portrait captures something about Gachet's own sadness, his recognition that he couldn't really save Vincent from himself. But perhaps the most poignant portraits are the ones Vincent never finished or barely started. In his final weeks at Auvers, he began a double portrait of two little girls, the daughters of a local carpenter. The painting exists only as a rough sketch, abandoned when Vincent died. Looking at it, you see not just two children, but the future Vincent never had, the paintings he never got to make, the life that ended just as he was hitting his creative peak. Vincent's approach to portraiture influenced countless artists who came after. The Expressionists took his idea that color and distortion could convey psychological states and ran with it. The portraits of Edvard Munch, Egon Schiele, Ernst Ludwig Kirchner all owe debts to Vincent's pioneering work in using portraits to explore inner experience rather than just external appearance. But Vincent's portraits also reveal something heartbreaking about his life, how few close relationships he maintained. Besides Theo, the people he painted were mostly acquaintances, not friends. The postman who was kind to him, the cafe owner who let him run a tab, the doctor assigned to treat him, the prostitutes he visited. These weren't intimate relationships, They were the limited social connections available to someone as difficult and isolated as Vincent. When he painted himself, he was painting the person he spent the most time with. Vincent van Gogh, that impossible, tortured, brilliant man who couldn't seem to function in normal society, but who could transform paint and canvas into windows into the human soul. The self-portraits are dialogues with himself, attempts to understand the person he saw in the mirror, to make sense of why he was the way he was. "I want to paint men and women with something of the eternal," he wrote. Looking at his portraits today, we see that he succeeded, though not in the way he might have hoped. These faces, rendered in his impossible colors and his urgent brushstrokes, have outlived their models by over a century. They've become eternally themselves and eternally Vincent, portraits of loneliness created by someone who understood loneliness intimately and transformed it into connection across time. Certain images obsessed Vincent during his final years, appearing again and again in his paintings like visual mantras. The cypress trees of Provence became particularly important, those dark, flame-shaped evergreens that dot the southern French landscape. Vincent saw something in them that went beyond mere botanical documentation. "The cypresses are always occupying my thoughts," he wrote from Saint-Rémy. "It astonishes me that they have not yet been done as I see them." To Vincent, the cypress was a masculine counterpoint to the feminine sunflower, a dark, vertical element that punctuated his compositions and reached toward the sky with an almost desperate energy. In Wheat Field with Cypresses, painted in 1889 from the asylum grounds, the trees twist upward like green flames while clouds swirl overhead and wheat waves in the wind. Everything in the painting moves, nothing is static. The cypress becomes a focal point, a kind of exclamation mark, emphasizing the energy flowing through the entire landscape. It's not a peaceful scene despite the bright colors and summer sunshine. It's nature as a dynamic, almost violent force. Vincent painted cypresses in multiple contexts, alone in fields, framing roads, dotting landscapes, silhouetted against skies. He studied how they caught light, how their dark, green-black color contrasted with other elements, how their vertical lines created compositional tension. They were, in his own words, beautiful as regards lines and proportions, like an Egyptian obelisk. The comparison to Egyptian obelisks hints at what cypresses meant to Vincent symbolically. They were monuments, markers of significance, connections between earth and sky. In Mediterranean cultures, cypresses were associated with death and mourning, often planted in cemeteries. Did Vincent know this? Did it inform his obsession with these trees during a period when his own mortality must have been much on his mind? Then there are the stars. Vincent painted starry skies throughout his career, but something changed in his later work. The stars stopped being mere points of light and became active participants in his compositions, swirling and pulsing with energy. In Café Terrace at Night, painted in Arles in 1888, the stars crowd the night sky above the illuminated café, their presence making the scene feel magical, almost fairy tale-like. But the Starry Night, painted from the asylum window in Saint-Rémy, takes this to another level entirely. The stars aren't just there, they're exploding, spiraling, generating visible waves of energy that ripple through the sky. The moon, huge and yellow, adds its own turbulence to the scene. The entire cosmos seems to be in motion, churning with forces we can't see, but Vincent has made visible through swirling brushstrokes and impossible colors. What's remarkable is that Vincent painted this from memory and imagination, not direct observation. The real view from his asylum window looked nothing like this. He'd taken elements of what he saw, the mountains, the village, the night sky, and transformed them into something that expressed his inner experience rather than external reality. The result is probably the most famous depiction of a night sky in Western art. The painting embodies a kind of cosmic loneliness. Down below, the village sleeps peacefully, windows dark, church spire pointing upward. But up above, the universe rages with energy that the sleeping townspeople neither see nor comprehend. It's tempting to read Vincent himself into this image, the lonely artist experiencing realities that others can't perceive, isolated by the very sensitivity that makes his art possible. The combination of cypress and stars appears in several paintings, most notably Road with Cypress and Star. Here, a huge cypress dominates the left side of the composition, while a brilliant star shines above. A horse-drawn carriage travels the road, tiny beneath these cosmic and natural elements. The cypress and the star become paired symbols, earthly and heavenly, both reaching upward, both marking significance in their different ways. Modern science has tried to identify the astronomical accuracy of Vincent's skies, determining which stars and planets were visible on particular nights. But this misses the point. Vincent wasn't painting astronomy textbook illustrations. He was painting how the night sky felt, the sense of vastness and energy and beauty that overcomes you when you really look up at stars. The swirls aren't scientifically accurate, but they're emotionally true. Cypresses and stars, dark and light, earth and sky, these paired elements gave structure to Vincent's exploration of landscape in his final years. They anchored his compositions while simultaneously suggesting transcendence, the possibility of meaning beyond the mere facts of fields and villages. In a life that offered little transcendence in practical terms, no success, no recognition, no escape from poverty and mental illness, Vincent found it in paint, in those swirling skies and flame-shaped trees that populate his canvases like prayers or declarations of faith in beauty despite everything. When you stand before the starry night in a museum, surrounded by crowds taking selfies, it's easy to forget what an achievement these paintings represent. A man in an asylum recovering from a mental breakdown painted the night sky with such conviction that over a century later we're still trying to understand how he did it, what it means, why it moves us so profoundly. Let's talk about the physical reality of Vincent's artistic practice, because understanding what painting cost him bodily helps explain both his achievement and his deterioration. Creating art wasn't just emotionally demanding for Vincent, it was literally toxic. The paints Vincent used were poison. Lead white, the foundation of his palette, contained lead that accumulated in the body over time, causing neurological damage. Emerald green contained arsenic compounds. Chrome yellow and cadmium yellow, those glorious yellows that dominate his sunflower paintings, contained chromium and cadmium, both toxic heavy metals. Cobalt blue contained cobalt. These weren't trace amounts, these were the primary components of his working materials. Vincent's painting technique made the situation worse. He'd sometimes hold the brush in his mouth while working, directly ingesting paint. He'd wipe his hands on his clothes, then handle food with paint-stained fingers. He worked in poorly ventilated spaces, breathing turpentine and paint fumes for hours at a stretch. When money was tight, which was most of the time, he'd skip meals to afford more paint and canvas, weakening his body's ability to process the toxins he was absorbing. Add to this his drinking. Vincent consumed substantial amounts of absinthe, that green fairy of 19th century Bohemia that contained thujon and was neurotoxic in large quantities. He drank cheap wine when he couldn't afford better. He smoked constantly. He survived on coffee and bread when he was working intensely, neglecting proper nutrition. By his 30s, his teeth were rotting, his stomach was constantly upset, his hands shook. The combination of paint toxicity, poor nutrition, heavy drinking, and Vincent's underlying mental health issues created a vicious cycle. The toxins worsened his mental state. the mental disturbances drove him to work even more frantically. The frantic work exposed him to more toxins. His body, attempting to cope with poisoning and malnutrition, weakened further. His immune system compromised, making him vulnerable to infections that someone healthy might shrug off. Some researchers believe Vincent's famous yellow vision, the way everything in his later paintings seems suffused with yellow light, might have been caused by digitalis poisoning from the foxglove extract Dr. Gachet prescribed. Digitalis toxicity creates a condition called xanthopsia, where everything appears yellow-tinted and lights develop halos. If true, some of Vincent's most famous stylistic choices were side effects of medication for a condition that was itself partly caused by paint poisoning. But even if we can't prove specific causal chains, the larger pattern is undeniable. Vincent's art was slowly killing him. Every masterpiece came at a cost measured in deteriorating health. Every morning spent painting in the fields under the brutal Provençal sun without proper food or water. Every evening spent in his studio inhaling turpentine fumes. Every night spent drinking to quiet the demons, and then waking up to do it all again. His letters to Theo document this deterioration. In earlier letters, he's full of energy and ambition. By the late 1880s, the letters increasingly mention health problems, stomach issues, insomnia, exhaustion, teeth problems, inexplicable pains. He'll describe completing a painting in a fever of inspiration, then being so depleted afterward that he can barely move for days. The creative peaks were followed by terrible crashes, the manic energy burning him up from inside. The painting Two Poplars in the Alpilles near Saint-Rémy from 1889 shows trees that seem to be burning, their leaves rendered in flames of yellow and orange against a turbulent sky. It's tempting to see these as self-portraits, representations of Vincent himself burning with creative fire, consuming himself in the process of creation. Consider what it means that Vincent painted roughly 2,000 works in just over a decade of serious artistic activity. That's nearly 200 works per year, more than one every 2 days on average. And these weren't dashed-off sketches. They were fully realized paintings, many of them masterpieces. The work rate was inhuman, driven by an urgency that seems to have sensed his time was limited. After his death, the autopsy reportedly found that his organs showed signs of severe stress and deprivation. His heart was enlarged from the strain, his liver was damaged, probably from both alcohol and paint toxin exposure. He was 37, but his body was that of a much older man who'd lived a much harder life. This raises uncomfortable questions. Would Vincent have lived longer if he'd painted less intensely? If he'd been more sensible about self-care, proper nutrition, avoiding toxins? Probably yes. But would he have created the works that make him matter? Would he have achieved the breakthrough that makes him Vincent van Gogh rather than just another struggling artist? Maybe not. It's not that suffering automatically creates great art. That's a romantic myth that's destroyed countless lives. But in Vincent's specific case, the intensity that drove his artistic breakthrough was inseparable from the intensity that drove his self-destruction. He couldn't throttle back, couldn't moderate, couldn't be less than completely consumed by his vision. This was simultaneously his greatest strength and his fatal flaw, the gift and the curse that defined his brief, brilliant, tragic life. Vincent's story cannot be told without Theo's. The younger brother, working as an art dealer in Paris, sent Vincent a monthly allowance from 1880 until Vincent's death in 1890. This money, usually around 150–200 francs per month, provided Vincent's rent, food, and art supplies. Without it, Vincent would have starved or been forced to give up painting. Every single painting Vincent created was enabled by Theo's support. But Theo gave Vincent more than money. He gave belief when no one else did. In a world that regarded Vincent as a failure, Theo saw genius. When Vincent's paintings sat unsold in the gallery, Theo continued insisting they were important. When Vincent had breakdowns and everyone else wrote him off as mad, Theo remained convinced his brother had something crucial to offer. The letters between the brothers reveal a relationship that went beyond normal sibling bonds. They were confidants, intellectual partners, co-conspirators in Vincent's artistic project. Vincent poured out everything to Theo: his artistic theories, his money troubles, his loneliness, his despair, his occasional moments of hope. Theo responded with emotional support, practical advice, and that crucial monthly check. "I cannot tell you how happy I am to have taken up painting again," Vincent wrote early in his artistic career. "I had long given up the thought, and it is thanks to you that I have come back to it." That single sentence encapsulates the relationship. Vincent had the vision and the talent, but Theo made it possible for those gifts to manifest as actual paintings. Theo's support wasn't passive financial enabling. He actively promoted Vincent's work, trying to interest collectors and critics, organizing Vincent's paintings in his apartment, showing them to anyone who might appreciate them. He sent Vincent news about art world developments, exhibition opportunities, which contemporary artists Vincent should pay attention to. He was Vincent's connection to the art world that Vincent himself couldn't navigate successfully. But the relationship wasn't completely one-sided. Vincent understood what Theo was giving up to support him. Theo earned a decent salary as an art dealer, but he wasn't wealthy. Supporting Vincent strained his finances, especially after he married Jo and they had a child. Vincent's guilt about this burden runs through his later letters. "I think so often of you," he wrote, "and I should like you too to feel that my work is solid enough not to be throwing money away." Theo had his own dreams and frustrations. He wanted to open his own gallery, showcasing modern artists, rather than the commercial works Goupil and C demanded he sell. He believed in the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists, but had to peddle conventional paintings to conservative collectors. Supporting Vincent was partly Theo's way of believing in art's future, investing in the kind of work he thought mattered, even if the market didn't agree yet. The psychological toll on Theo was enormous. He worried constantly about Vincent's health, his mental state, his future. The letters from Arles describing arguments with Gauguin alarmed him. The telegram announcing Vincent had cut off part of his ear devastated him. The subsequent breakdowns and hospitalizations created chronic anxiety. How do you support someone you love when you can't actually fix what's wrong? When Vincent died in July 1890, something broke in Theo. He'd been struggling with syphilis symptoms for years, and the stress of Vincent's death accelerated his deterioration. At Vincent's funeral, Theo was described as heartbroken beyond words. Within weeks, his health collapsed completely. He had a mental breakdown, possibly related to tertiary syphilis attacking his brain. By November, he was in a psychiatric hospital in Utrecht. Jo later described visiting Theo there and finding him in terrible condition, sometimes lucid, but often lost in delusions and despair. He talked about Vincent constantly, couldn't accept that his brother was gone. In his more lucid moments, he obsessed about making sure Vincent's paintings were preserved and appreciated. It was as if he'd transferred his life's purpose from supporting Vincent alive to supporting Vincent's legacy after death. Theo died on January 25, 1891, just 6 months after Vincent. He was 33 years old. The official cause was dementia paralytica, caused by syphilis, but anyone who knew him understood that grief had killed him as surely as disease. When Jo had his body moved from Utrecht to be buried next to Vincent in Auvers, she was honoring the bond that had defined both brothers' lives. Today, their graves lie side by side in the cemetery at Auvers-sur-Oise, covered in ivy that someone planted to connect them. Thousands of people visit every year to pay respects to Vincent, and hopefully some of them spare a thought for Theo, the person who made it all possible. The tragedy of their story is that neither lived to see Vincent's posthumous success. Theo never knew that his faith in Vincent's genius would be vindicated. He died thinking he'd failed, unable to convince the world of what he saw in those paintings that filled his Paris apartment. But without his decade of unwavering support, none of those paintings would exist. Vincent van Gogh, the household name, the museum exhibitions, the record-breaking auctions, all of it rests on Theo's belief and sacrifice. Every time someone stands amazed before a Van Gogh painting, they're seeing Theo's faith made visible as surely as Vincent's vision. Vincent died in 1890. The silence that followed wasn't permanent, but it took time for the world to catch up with what he'd accomplished. The first responses came from fellow artists who'd known him. Émile Bernard wrote an obituary for a small art journal. Paul Gauguin, despite their disastrous time together in Arles, acknowledged Vincent's importance. A few small exhibitions included his work alongside other modern painters. But these were ripples, not waves. The person who transformed ripples into waves was Jo van Gogh Bonga, Theo's widow. After both brothers died within months of each other, Jo was left with an infant son, limited means, and hundreds of Vincent's paintings that nobody wanted. She could have sold them quickly for whatever she could get and moved on with her life. Many people would have done exactly that. Instead, Jo devoted herself to building Vincent's reputation. She organized exhibitions, lent works to galleries, carefully managed which paintings went where and for how much. She edited and published Vincent's letters to Theo, revealing the thoughtful, articulate person behind the madman stereotype. She gave interviews, wrote articles, became the keeper of Vincent's flame. Her son, Vincent van Gogh, later continued this work, eventually helping establish the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam. The recognition came gradually. By the 1900s, critics were starting to notice. An exhibition in Paris in 1901 created significant buzz. Suddenly, Vincent wasn't just another failed artist. He was a pioneer, someone who'd pointed the way toward modern art's future. The Faubes, particularly Henri Matisse and André Derain, acknowledged their debt to Vincent's bold color use. The German expressionists saw him as a spiritual predecessor, someone who'd shown that art could express inner emotional states directly. The myth of the tortured artist began growing alongside appreciation for the work. The story about cutting off his ear became famous, sometimes exaggerated beyond recognition. Vincent became a symbol, the misunderstood genius, the artist who suffered for his vision, the person whose brilliance was only recognized after death. This romanticization had positive and negative effects. It drew attention to the work, but also sometimes overshadowed it, making Vincent's personal tragedy more famous than his artistic achievement. By the 1920s and 1930s, Vincent was firmly established in the art historical canon. Museums fought to acquire his paintings. Scholars wrote dissertations about his technique, his influences, his place in art history. Books proliferated, each offering theories about his madness, his method, his meaning. He became part of popular culture, referenced in novels and poems, his name synonymous with misunderstood genius. The commercial explosion came later. In 1987, irises sold for $53.9 million, then a record for any painting. In 1990, Portrait of Dr. Gachet went for $82.5 million. These astronomical prices had little to do with art appreciation and everything to do with investment speculation, wealthy collectors treating paintings like stocks. Vincent, who'd sold maybe one painting in his lifetime, was posthumously making someone incredibly rich. Today, Vincent's paintings are scattered across the world's major museums. The Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam houses the largest collection. The Museum of Modern Art in New York has The Starry Night. The National Gallery in London has Sunflowers. The Musée d'Orsay in Paris has The Bedroom, and many others. These museums are perpetually crowded, lines of people waiting to see paintings by a man who died thinking nobody cared about his work. The cultural impact goes beyond museums. Vincent's face appears on coffee mugs, t-shirts, refrigerator magnets. Starry Night has been reproduced so many times on so many products that it's hard to see it fresh. Don McLean wrote Vincent, Starry, Starry Night, a song that's been heard by millions, embedding Vincent's story in popular consciousness. Movies have dramatized his life. Novelists have fictionalized it. He's become arguably the most famous painter in the world, certainly the most famous to people who don't normally care about art. This ubiquity creates a paradox. Vincent is simultaneously overexposed and underappreciated. Everyone knows his name, but how many people understand what made his paintings revolutionary? The coffee mug reproductions flatten and domesticate works that were radical in their day. Starry Night, on a dorm room poster, loses the physical presence, the thick paint, the visible brushstrokes that make the original so powerful. Moreover, the focus on Vincent's suffering, while understandable, sometimes obscures his achievement. Yes, he had mental health struggles. Yes, he died tragically young. But he wasn't a passive victim of circumstance. He made conscious artistic choices, developed sophisticated theories about color and composition, worked incredibly hard to perfect his techniques. His paintings aren't interesting just because a sad man made them. They're interesting because they're formally innovative, emotionally powerful, visually stunning achievements. Perhaps the truest memorial to Vincent isn't in museums or markets, but in the countless people who've found comfort in knowing someone else has felt overwhelming despair and still created beauty. Everyone who's felt like a failure and taken hope from Vincent's posthumous success. Everyone who's struggled with mental health and drawn strength from his determination to keep working despite everything. Everyone who's made art nobody wanted and found validation in his example. I put my heart and soul into my work and have lost my mind in the process. Vincent wrote that in a letter shortly before his death. Looking at his paintings today, we see both halves of that statement made visible, the heart and soul poured into every brushstroke and the cost of that pouring out. As we come to the end of Vincent's story, let's consider what he left us beyond beautiful paintings, because Vincent van Gogh's life, for all its pain and failure by conventional measures, contains lessons that remain relevant more than a century after his death. First, there's the lesson about persistence. Vincent didn't start painting seriously until his late 20s. He had no formal training, no prospects, no reason to believe he'd succeed. Every practical indicator suggested he should give up. He was poor. He couldn't sell his work. Critics ignored or mocked him. The smart, reasonable choice would have been to find a stable job and paint as a hobby. Vincent chose differently. He kept painting through poverty, rejection, mental illness, isolation. He kept painting when nobody wanted his paintings. He kept painting until he couldn't paint anymore. This isn't to suggest that anyone should starve for their art or that suffering automatically creates great work. But Vincent demonstrates something important about creative persistence. You keep going because the work itself matters, not because external validation tells you it matters. The paintings were their own justification, regardless of whether anyone bought them or praised them. Second, there's the lesson about seeing the world differently. Vincent looked at things everyone else looked at: sunflowers, stars, peasants working fields, simple bedrooms, and saw something others missed. He didn't paint what things looked like. He painted what they felt like, what they meant, what they were beneath surface appearance. This required courage, the willingness to trust his own vision even when it diverged from accepted artistic practice. We all have this capacity to see beneath surfaces, to perceive the emotional truth of things. Most of us suppress it because it's safer to see what everyone else sees. to agree about what's real and what matters. Vincent shows us what becomes possible when you don't suppress that individual vision, when you trust that your particular way of seeing might be valuable especially if it's strange. Third, there's the lesson about mental health. Vincent struggled with what we'd now recognize as serious mental illness. He had breakdowns, heard voices, experienced episodes where he lost touch with reality. This destroyed his life in many ways, costing him relationships, opportunities, any chance at conventional success or happiness. But somehow, between the breakdowns, he created transcendent beauty. He shows us that mental illness doesn't define a person completely, that someone can be both struggling and brilliant, both suffering and creating meaning. This is particularly important today when we're finally starting to talk openly about mental health issues. Vincent's example isn't romanticizing mental illness. There's nothing romantic about psychotic breaks and self-mutilation, but it is showing that people dealing with mental health challenges can still contribute enormously to human culture, still deserve dignity and support, still have gifts the rest of us need. Fourth, there's the lesson about relationships. Theo's support of Vincent shows us something profound about how love works, how belief in someone can enable achievements that would be impossible alone. Theo never got to see Vincent's success, never received anything tangible in return for his decade of financial and emotional support. But he gave anyway, believed anyway, kept supporting Vincent because that's what love sometimes requires. We all need our Theos, people who believe in us when we don't believe in ourselves, who support our unlikely dreams even when practical wisdom suggests they should encourage us to be more realistic. And perhaps we all need to be someone's Theo occasionally, offering support without expecting immediate returns, believing in potential we can see even when the person we're supporting can't see it themselves. Fifth, there's the lesson about how we judge success and failure. Vincent died believing he'd failed. By almost any conventional measure, financial success, social respect, romantic fulfillment, career achievement, he had failed. But those conventional measures missed what mattered. Vincent succeeded absolutely at the one thing he cared about most, creating art that expressed his vision with complete honesty and intensity. He never compromised, never painted what he thought would sell, never diluted his vision to make it more palatable. A century later, which matters more? That he died poor and rejected, or that he created works that millions of people find meaningful? The answer seems obvious now, but only because time has vindicated him. While he was alive, the answer was much less clear. This suggests we should be careful about judging success too quickly, recognizing that some achievements only reveal their importance later. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, Vincent teaches us that beauty can emerge from pain. Not because pain is necessary for beauty, that's a dangerous myth, but because even in the midst of tremendous suffering, humans remain capable of creating meaning, of transforming their anguish into something that speaks to others experiencing their own struggles. When you stand before Starry Night or Irises or the Potato Eaters, you're seeing someone's pain transformed into something that transcends that pain, that speaks across centuries to anyone willing to look. You're seeing proof that despair doesn't have to be the final word, that creation remains possible even when destruction seems inevitable, that art can make sense of a life that made no sense while it was being lived. The sadness will last forever, Vincent said on his deathbed. And maybe he was right. Maybe the sadness does last forever. But so does the beauty. So do the paintings. So does Vincent. And so we come to the end of our journey with Vincent van Gogh, that red-haired, intense, impossible man who transformed paint and canvas into windows, into the human soul. As you drift towards sleep tonight, perhaps you'll dream of those swirling stars, those golden wheat fields, those sunflowers burning with impossible yellowness. Vincent's life was short and by most measures unhappy, but it wasn't meaningless. Through his paintings, he speaks to us still, reminding us that beauty exists even in darkness, that creation remains possible even in despair, that seeing the world differently isn't madness but a kind of necessary vision. The sadness did last forever. But so did the starry nights, so did the sunflowers, so did the proof that one person, against all odds, can create something that matters long after they're gone. Rest well, friend, and remember, tomorrow is another day, another chance to see the world the way Vincent did, intensely, beautifully, honestly, with all the colors singing and all the stars swirling overhead. Until our next journey together, good night.